Hello everyone and welcome back. So today's video is going to be my top 10 books of 2020. I never did one of these videos in 2020 for 2019. I am sure I did one covering 2018, so if I do find that video I'll link that up in the card. But sometimes I can't be bothered to do like best of like videos, because actually I think to really have not have a best of but have a favorites video of books, like you need to have read the book more than once. I think sort of Marina did this in her video where she sort of explained the way she categorizes like sort of best and like long-term favorite, and I feel exactly the same as her. So when I saw that I was like, someone who feels exactly the same as me. I would say that these books that I'm going to speak about are books that actually I had a very strong emotional reaction to them and really liked the writing style, or liked the idea that the author was playing with. What I actually did, because I know the kind of reader that I am, is looked at my Goodreads things that I'd rated 4 and 5 stars, because actually even though I might have rated a book 4 stars, they still feature in this list over the other books that I rated 5 stars, because when I look back at them I think, well, I know this one wasn't as strongly well written as this one, but actually I had a really great emotional connection to it, and therefore like it's gonna be in the sort of best. So that's what I did. I sort of looked at my 4 and 5 star reads, narrowed it down to 10, left it for a week, went back to that top 10 list, looked at that and was just like, do you deserve to be there, do you not? And then shifted some of the books out. So I'm left with 10 books, which I think do actually represent sort of what I appreciate about reading, and actually hopefully these books I will reread them in the coming years, so that actually if they're going to be a long-term favourite I will know upon a second reread. But speaking of that, a book that I'm going to talk about that is probably in one of my favourite books, and I have said this before on my channel, and I think this is the 3rd time I've read this book now, is Sundowners by Leslie Loco. When did I first read this? I don't know. I'll put it on the screen when I look at my Goodreads. But I love this upon like my 3rd reread. It's one of those books that I'm just like, I don't know if I would recommend it to everyone, because not much happens in this book, and that's one of the criticisms in this book. But for me, all that happens is all I need to happen, really. So this book follows 4 friends. It's a book about friendship. It actually starts off with our main character Rhiannon, and she is in South Africa, and her family sort of own like a gold mine or something like that. She's a white South African, and her family like owned some sort of gold mine, and there are some suspicious circumstances surrounding her father. Her mother passed away in a tragic sort of swimming pool accident, and her father basically just like disappeared off the face of the earth. So she's raised by her aunt, and I think one of the reasons her aunt sends her away is sort of to do with like a family reason, but also I think her aunt just thinks she's like super lazy. Her aunt is like this powerhouse in this like diamond industry that they own, but obviously that's at the mercy of like all black folks, so you know, I didn't feel like the aunt was a great character. So her aunt basically sends her to a boarding school in England to sort of basically get her to do something with her life, like, you know, so that she can't just sit around the house spending money and just like having no sort of aspirations for the future, especially because her aunt also has 2 kids, and these kids of hers also have aspirations for the future. So that's what we sort of focus on Rhiannon, and then through Rhiannon going to this boarding school she meets 3 other girls at this boarding school, and yeah, they're all different characters. So the other characters in this story are Gabrielle. It says here, intelligent, loyal and always worrying about everyone else. Gabby needs to start looking after one. Gabrielle's story, I believe that her parents, like I think her dad and mum do earn a decent living, or at least it's the dad anyway, but he's like super stingy, and I think he's quite physically abusive towards like her mum and maybe Gabby as well. And so actually Gabby spends a lot of time with her nan, but like her dad is like super stingy, like he never gives her money for clothes and things like that. So like even though he sent her to this posh boarding school, like actually everything else is quite like I don't want to say poor about her, because it's not, but it's not as lavish as the other students at this school. And then it says Natalie, or it might be Nathalie because there's a H in it. It says, for pretty petite Natalie, a shrewd eye for business helps her forget the one man she can't have. So her in the sense of her family structure, she has like an older brother, and also a mum who I think is like on her 3rd marriage, has married a really rich man. So that's sort of how she's in that school. And the final one is Charmaine, an outrageous flirt. Charmaine just needs to find someone to pay for the good life she so desperately wants. I actually think all of this at the back is blurred quite badly, but Charmaine is the daughter of a single mother. I think either the dad left or the dad is dead. I don't know too much, but there's no real focus on him. So yeah, she has a single mother, and I think like the mum just gets like loads of checks. So that's how they've all ended up like at this boarding school, and it takes you from when they're like 17 up until I would say they're like in their 40s at this point, and you just follow the basic ins and outs of their lives. And I think what this book manages to do is convey a strong sense of friendship, but also how how much one can keep away from their friends and when really terrible things are going on in their lives. Like, these girls go through a lot of ups and downs, and I think the one thing that actually really is a focal point in this book is money, because Rianne comes from money and continues really to sort of stay afloat because of the sort of money she has and her looks. The girls' sort of careers, for example, that they go into, Rianne becomes a model. So, you know, she's already got like loads of money, she becomes a model, and then like she gets loads of money from that. Gabrielle sort of goes down the path of like, she goes to Oxford and stuff like that, and sort of does things to do with human rights and things like that. Natalie, like it says in the back of the book, a shrewd eye for business, becomes like a businesswoman. She sort of flounces around for a bit, not really knowing what she wants to do. And Charmaine is the sort of tragic one in this book. I don't know if this is sort of trying to comment on the sort of single family structure she comes from, but she very much falls prey to sort of rich men who have loads of money, who like do drugs and sort of really bad influences, and that ranges from like men her age to like older men, and like really horrible things happen in this book to Charmaine. Like, there is a really tragic sort of scene in this book as well, and it's the one thing I remembered from this book actually, but then as I was reading it I was like, oh, maybe I remembered wrong, so then I got a sense of security, and then it happened and I was just like, I'm very sad now. There is also a boys' private school like next to the girls' sort of school. It's in the same town or whatever, and actually some of their lives link in with sort of the people that they meet in from there. And one of the characters is a boy who is the son of a man who is essentially like Nelson Mandela's right-hand man. So, you know, it's sort of weaved in sort of actual events, but made, obviously it's very fictional. So it's set against that backdrop as well, but also being focused on like London, Shanghai, LA, I think is the other place as well. So it's just a really nice character study about people. I found it very interesting. Managed to weave in some real life events. Good read. So yes, this is number 10 on my list. Number 9 on my list is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I absolutely fell in love with James Baldwin writing. That this is the reason that this really is in my top 10. I also did enjoy the story. I think it benefits from a second read, because actually I've seen a few like people comment when I did speak about it in my video about things that actually I didn't pick up on, so I'd love to give this a second reread. James Baldwin writing is fantastic. Giovanni's Room is about our main character David. So yeah, a young American in 1915 Paris who's waiting for his fiancée to return from Spain. So whilst he's in Paris, he ends up meeting this guy named Giovanni, a handsome Italian barman, and they're drawn together in an intense affair. David is not like a guy that's out and out gay. Like, you know, actually he never really comes out like even to Giovanni. So there's definitely a case of him protecting himself. What this book takes you through is the sort of, I want to say a couple of days, it feels like a couple of days, but I think it's a span over a couple of weeks that they spend together, and how their relationship sort of develops. You see how they meet, you see how they are together, but then eventually, and it says right here on the back, so this isn't a spoiler, it says, after 3 months David's fiancée returns, and denying his true nature, David rejects Giovanni for a safe future as a married man. His decision eventually brings tragedy. And that's what it is. You sort of see their relationship blossom, you see the intensity of it, then you see the sort of rejection, and then you see the terrible outcome of it. In a way, it did feel a bit dramatic, but maybe in the 1950s, like this was a bit like realistic. And I'm sure it could happen now. It just, to me, in some way, it felt a bit dramatic, but in the throes of love, who knows what one will do. But I just found that the writing in this was actually quite stunning. I think that's what stood out to me the most, and I actually really enjoyed the story. It's not something that I thought I would have enjoyed, not because of its nature, but just because the story is okay, but I think it's really amped up by James Baldwin's writing and the sort of thoughts that David has about Paris, about his sort of life in America with his dad. He sort of touches on like sort of earlier sort of teenage memories where something similar kind of happened. So it's a really good insight as well into sort of David's feeling. David is actually quite, I would say, quite a cold and sort of and removed narrator, I would say. Like, you just feel like he's very distant from the things that are happening to him. He can't really ever fully like relish in his feelings, so then he feels quite cold and distant, and that really shows through in this book. But the writing off the chart. So I definitely want to read some more James Baldwin this year because I was thoroughly impressed by this. The book that is 8th on my list is Hercule Poirot's Christmas by Agatha Christie. Of course there was going to be an Agatha Christie in my top 10. I say of course, but actually when I read a lot of the, or listen to a lot of the Agatha Christie's, I tend to just give them 3 stars. They're all books that I like, but you know, that I don't hold them in the highest regard. And actually this was a book that I gave 4 stars. The book that I gave 5 stars, I'm pretty sure, is Appointment with Death by Agatha Christie. But this one is one that I always remember, so that's sort of why I've decided to include it in my top 10, because I don't know, I think about all the other stories that I've sort of listened to so far, and even the ones that I've watched. It's one that I always remember because actually I think it's really, really well crafted. I think it's really well crafted in so many aspects, so that's definitely why it's number 8. As the title would suggest, this novel takes place around Christmas time. Hercule Poirot is called into some town in England after the death of a character named Simeon Lee. And Simeon Lee is a particularly nasty character, even up until he dies. It's not even like, oh, he was a nasty old man. In bits, like, you actively see the story sort of opens up in his house and him dealing with his family members, and then like probably like 3/4 of the way of the story, then Hercule Poirot is called in. So you get to spend some time with the family, and you just see that this guy, like, to the bone, is really evil. So you get to hear about his sort of previous life and how basically he started his beginnings in sort of diamonds, and I'm pretty sure he was also in South Africa and then sort of got some diamonds and then came to the UK and sort of made his fortune. And it opens up on Christmas with his family. He has, I think, 2 sons and 1 sort of estranged son. And it opens up with him basically telling like some of the family members that, oh yeah, like I have a surprise for you, like your brother that you bloody hate, you know, my estranged son, he's coming for Christmas. I've also invited this random person who is his daughter, so his granddaughter, but like the family have never met her. Basically the family are all like, why have you invited these people? So basically it's a whole good old family affair at Christmas, and everyone's just wondering what the sort of play is here, because they know that Simeon Lee is not a very nice man. And actually on the day, or maybe it's Christmas Day or the day before, the granddad basically calls them into, or their dad basically calls them into the room and basically talks about the fact that he wants to change his will. The daughter of his daughter, his granddaughter, arrives, and everyone's also a bit like, okay, like, cool, why is she here? So they're trying to get to know her. And basically I think it is on Christmas Day he ends up dying. There is a loud squeal in the house, there's a lot of things dropping everywhere, and they go to like the door of his study to try and open it, and it's locked. So everyone's just like, why is it locked? They break open the door, find him dead, and it's at this point that Poirot is called in. And I just think that this story was just really well crafted in the sense, as a puzzle mystery, actually all the clues were there. All the clues were there so that you could suss out the suspect, and I felt that like reading the book and also watching it. I have to say I did already watch the ITV adaptation before I'd listened to the book, so I did know what was going to happen, but just upon sort of remembering the ITV adaptation and listening to the book, the clues are there. There's obviously up to someone who is very like, you know, clued on to be like, actually we haven't got the connecting piece for this, but that works. So that's like the first thing I really enjoyed about this. I thought that the clues are there, you're able to solve it. 2, I think I really like sort of Poirot's little isms in this. There is a bit in this where Poirot buys a fake mustache, and again it's one of those things that you would sort of make the connection if you had been reading closely when he sort of comments about like other people. And I find it really funny just because other people sort of like he orders it in and people sort of snoop in his mail and they're like, why, what is this funny man doing, like why has he ordered a moustache? I just found that really funny. Like it's such a Poirot thing, but actually an astute reader would have been able to put together like maybe what he was getting at. The third thing that I really liked in this was the sort of exploration of the characters and sort of what Agatha Christie was saying about sort of people like Simeon Lee, and just sort of about sort of in a way as well family structures. There are some like other twists and turns in this book of other people in this book, but one of the strongest feelings that you take away from this book is sort of how evil Simeon Lee is, and it's not like he ever stops. He's quite relentless in it and very much sets out to hurt people, and so in a way the death of him isn't sad. Like you read this book and although you're like, okay, a murder has happened, when you're listening to sort of all the characters talk about him, it's very hard to feel sorry that this man is dead. And I think that's you know, you're supposed to feel bad that someone has been murdered, you know, no matter how bad someone has been, you know, murder is not a thing we condone. But I think actually what Agatha Christie really forces you to look at or think about is the sort of moral quandary of this guy was really evil. He did some really evil things and he was basically torturing his family. It really makes you think about sort of a person, characters, and who people are. So I found that very interesting, and that is the reason why that's number 8. Number 7 is Slate in Your Lane, the Black Girl Bible, and this is by Yomi and Elizabeth. I think I have already spoken about this book on my channel, but I just like this book for the amount of sort of care, attention, detail that was put into all these essays to create a sort of, yeah, Bible, a guide for black women in the UK. It's definitely something I wish I'd read just sort of when I was like 22, 23. It would have been so like sort of helpful and so comforting. It's basically a series of essays that focus on, I think each of the authors basically writes an essay on these subjects. So these subjects are education, work, getting ahead, representation, dating, health, oh yeah, and that's it. And what they do is weave in sort of experiences or quotes from other sort of notable black figures in the UK, black women in the UK. And I just thought it was great. I think it was just so good to have a source for black women in the UK going into corporate roles, navigating like workplaces, but also being in school and just talking about different experiences at uni. Like they talk about experiences at uni through to sort of just like getting into uni and being like, probably it depends on what uni you go to obviously, but being maybe the only black face in like a space of white faces, or like talking about things to the African and Caribbean societies at uni and how they sort of navigated those spaces. So they talk about a whole host of things, and I just thought it was really refreshing. I like that there was just this one book that collected all of these things together, and in the middle there are some photos of the sort of so this is Yomi and Elizabeth, but then there's also more photos of like the other contributors that they sort of had to this, or the people that they spoke to. Another book that I absolutely loved in 2020 was Ain't I Woman? Black Women and Feminism by Bell Hooks. I actually did a whole video where I spoke about this in my non-fiction November wrap up, because I read it as part of non-fiction November, and I'm so glad I finally picked up something by Bell Hooks. The reason why I love this was honestly for the simplicity and ease of the writing. It talked about obviously black women and feminism, but it was so accessible that actually I felt like, yes, I understand like a lot of what she's saying. I didn't feel like it was going over my head. The book goes from black women and being on plantations and sort of talking about the expectations of women there, the role of women, how women were treated, to sort of even when women were living with other men, black men, how they were treated by those black men and what they were expected to do, even though they were all in the same situation, you know, having to like pick cotton on the field, through to sort of like the women's rights movement and how black women were treated there, how black women were treated in the workplace when women were allowed to work, and sort of the hatred that was sort of thrown at them by other white women. So just showing that basically on many levels black women in America, and I would say obviously across the globe as well, the violence that they face from basically all angles, the non-support from black men to non-support of just other races in general, and other women just sort of not supporting them, and how detrimental that has been to the progress of black women. I just thought it was very interesting. I would have loved something focused on the UK, but that is on me to sort of find it. But I really loved this for how simple it was. It was just so accessible and just really eye-opening personally for me. And I think at so many points she touches on so many different intersections, and she closes with sort of, you know, hope for what can be done going forward, which I think is really important. When you read a book like that, that's all sort of doom and gloom actually, especially for someone like Bell Hooks, who does her research in this area to offer examples of how we can sort of move forward, make the movement more inclusive, and just make sure that the movement isn't damaging to black women as it goes further and further ahead. The 5th book on my list is Freshwater by Akeke Emeze. I really enjoyed this book. I loved what Akeke Emeze did with this, and it makes me have much more of an emotional like sort of connection to it, knowing that actually some parts of this are based on the author's life. This book is about Ada, our character, who I think is essentially visited by Obajni, I don't know if I'm saying it properly, which is I think a Yoruba term dealing with I think it's basically the spirit of a child, like that when mothers don't carry a baby to term, and so basically the family, the spirit visits the mum over and over again, so actually she never like gives birth to her children. But I guess in this sense, my understanding of it could be wrong, but I think in this sense actually finally Ada is the child, and actually instead of causing the mum to miscarry, the spirits have just basically decided to sort of fracture Ada, the actual character. So it says here, Ada has always been unusual. Her parents prayed it into existence, but something must have gone awry. The troubled child begins to develop separate selves and is prone to fits of anger and grief. And that's exactly what happens, is she develops these separate selves, and they sort of, in a way, actually what you find out through the course of the book is the separate selves help her deal with actually some really traumatic events happening in her life. So really it's a bit like she's dissociating, in all honesty. And what happens is you sort of follow her in her childhood home. I think she is in Nigeria at that point, but then she moves to America and goes to college, and I think it's at that point another traumatic event happens, and really that sort of I don't know, causes the cells to sort of take over her, and she becomes these different people that she can't really remember being them, and different things happen. And in a way it's just the sort of thing that happens to allow her to protect herself, to stop her from actually dealing with what is happening at the moment. What strikes me about this book is how like trauma inducing it basically is. You have to sort of read this book, I don't know, when you're in a good place, because there is a lot of sad and traumatic things happening in this, and a lot of it deals with sexual abuse, so it's not a nice thing to read about. And I think for Ekweke to sort of include some of the things that they felt growing up into this sort of fictional story makes it that all the more powerful, if I'm honest. I think by Ekweke sort of putting all of these things down to paper, it brings to light so many of the traumatic things that can happen to people, and also the different ways in which they cope with those things, and how those things sort of manifest themselves or present themselves, that actually a lot of society doesn't talk about. So I don't know, I just felt like this was a really powerful like fiction book, but also part memoir, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's one I will be giving a reread, but definitely in like making sure that I am in a good place. The fourth book of my list is How You Might Know Me by Sabrina Mufaz. This was a poetry collection, and again I have already spoken about this book in great detail, this poetry collection in great detail. What this poetry collection essentially focuses on is sort of prostitution and sex in the UK. It does this through the lens of 4 women, and we sort of hear their stories and their life experiences, sort of how sort of prostitution sort of is the centre focus of all these things, but how it feeds into other aspects of their life. So it's sort of dealing with when they're with clients, but also sort of in day-to-day other jobs that they have, all the reasons why they are doing it. And I don't know, I think each character gets about maybe 7 to 10 poems sort of exploring different aspects of their lives. I thought Mufaz's writing was just stunning, in all honesty. Like, I really loved how she played with words and how she sort of crafted these stories for these women. And actually, as a collection of what it explores, I also found it just really insightful, and I felt like I learned a lot of new things, even though like obviously it was a poetry collection. So I think originally I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I think I do actually want to bump up my rating to 5 stars, because it was just such a solid collection and I really did enjoy it. So we're on to the final 3, and the one that takes the 3rd spot is I'm Telling the Truth But I'm Lying by Bassey Ikpe. I loved what this book evoked in me. I just felt all sorts of things for Bassey. This is an essay collection in which Bassey Ikpe talks about her experience with anxiety and bipolar 2. So it is a memoir and essay, as it says on the back. She explores life as a Nigerian American immigrant, a black woman, a slam poet, a mother, a daughter, an artist, through the lens of mental health and a diagnosis of bipolar 2 and anxiety. And again, much like Freshwater, it is sort of reading about really sad experiences in people's lives and sort of how they cope with that. And I think that's probably why in those 2 books I felt like such an emotional pull to that, because it is the ability to cope, the different ways in which people cope, and I'm just so interested in that. And in this sense as well, the story focuses on bits of her love life, her being really confused about like what is happening to her, because at the time she didn't have any of these diagnoses, so didn't know what was happening. Talks about sort of her career, and just her life, and how she sort of dealt with all these horrible feelings about herself, and not being able to move, not being able to sort of summon the energy to do the things that she really wanted to do, and just being so confused about why. And I think that's the really sort of parts that I really connected with. I also just thought she was an excellent writer. Like, I thought this was really well crafted, really well written, and I think she just manages to invoke so much emotion in you, and you just feel like really sorry for her. And I'm sure like obviously loads of people don't want someone to always feel sorry for them, but you really get a sense of the pain and that she's suffering. And yeah, I think she manages to really craft, like, there are certain scenes where she's talking about like not being able to move from the sofa, not being able to move from the bed, and hearing phones ringing and people trying to get in contact with her. You really get a sense of her tiredness and her just not being able to like snap out of it or anything like that. So I thought it was really well written, and also the content was just really good. I could relate, and for that reason it gets 3rd place. The book that takes 2nd place is Seed to Harvest by Octavia E. Butler. I'm just giving this whole collection a 2nd place really, because I spoke about this in a video, and I can't remember what video it was now, or the science fiction one, where I definitely go into more detail about all the different plots, but in this one I'm just going to give the whole collection second place because I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this dive into sort of Octavia E. Butler's work, and I think I'm really grateful actually that it was this that I read, because I've heard the other stuff can be a bit more sci-fi, but this for me was just good. It was the perfect level to sort of like, or perfect introduction to her writing and the things that she writes about, and I loved it. So this collection contains Wild Seed, Mind of My Mind, Clay's Arc and Pattern Master. Mind of My Mind is definitely by far my favourite. Pattern Master probably follows second, Clay's Arc, and then Wild Seed was just okay. But I just think what an excellent writer Octavia Butler is. Like, her writing is very simple, and I think that's fine because of the ideas that she's exploring. I think she writes in a way that is actually really well paced. I never felt like anything was just happening so quickly that it happened out of the blue and then it was like an abrupt ending. It was never like that. I felt like everything was fully explored, even in the aspects of like Clay's Arc where it's actually very much a novella. Like, I actually still felt that was really well paced. So everything just felt really crafted together. I felt like the sort of the world that we were living in was explored well, and we were actually able to sort of spend time on the planet and understand what was happening. I think that's also because actually a lot of it closely mirrors the world now, or at least the world then, so it's not very hard to sort of understand what is happening. This collection of books is basically the Pattern Master series. So in the first one we focus on a sort of demigod named Doro, and also another female demigod, Anyewu, and they sort of birth this race of, I don't even know, like psychics, telepaths, visionaries, all these amazing things. Like, it was already something that Doro was working on, and you sort of get the background in that book, and he sort of joins forces with Anyewu to just sort of birth this line of like superhuman people basically, and that's what follows in the subsequent stories. In Mind of My Mind, we focus more on sort of the children of like Doro and Anyewu's, like it's their children's, and all these people, they all carry powers, and it's sort of about the world that they're creating and the world that they're building, and sort of Doro's like overall hopes and dreams. And in Clay's Arc, what we actually focus on is, we're in the same world but we're focused on like other races in that, and this one is actually more like what I like to deem a contagion novel, because in this sense it's a sort of wild race going around like carjacking people and sort of biting them, trying to give them the disease that they have, which they do give them, and then sort of carry on their race. And then in Pattern Master we sort of see like what we experience in Mind of My Mind, way more involved. It involves like completely different characters, and we sort of see how what was sort of established in Mind of My Mind, how that is like many years later. And then it also includes sort of the enemies per se of the Clay's Arcs, and sort of how you see basically how the Clay Arcs sort of function in the society that we're living in. So it's so good. Like, I just think that the sort of people she's created and the way she's explained the different powers that they have and what like Doro was trying to do, so easily digestible. You can easily understand it. You're so interested and invested. Personally, I was anyway, invested in what's going to happen next. And I just felt like whatever she spoke about in the different worlds, I still really enjoyed. Like, Wild Seed is the only one that I was a bit like, I could do without. And these are put together so that they follow the sort of line, like linear timeline they would in this world. But actually I think Wild Seed was published last. Pattern Master, which is the last one in the series, was published first, and then it sort of goes in between the other two. So what Wild Seed does a lot is give you a lot of background as to how all of this was created. But honestly, I wouldn't say flawless world. It's not a flawless world. There were so many flaws, but the idea that she built in there sounds amazing. The idea of sort of the telepath that she built, and sort of connection of people coming together, and that sort of strength in sort of coming together and creating that huge bond. There's something to be said about the overall sort of message in this book, and that's what I love. But honestly, flawless collection. So the book that takes the #1 spot on my list is Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. I've spoken about this book I think countless times by now, but it was just one I really enjoyed, and I actually cannot wait to buy a physical copy of it. I listened to it as an audiobook and it just blew me away. Like, I started listening it thinking I wouldn't like it, and then I just loved it. So this is a memoir, and it is told for like a YA audience, and what Echo does throughout this is weave in basically like wizard training. She starts off each sort of chapter being like the first lesson of wizard training. I don't know if it gets up to about 15 lessons or something, but they're essentially lessons that she's learnt in her life. And what this talks about is sort of black families. It talks about addiction, it talks about mental health, it talks about education, it talks about so many things. Echo's upbringing is quite rough. Her mum suffers from a drug addiction, or at least like she does throughout the course of the book. You sort of see like her, like as she's narrating to us, how you sort of see her brothers sort of getting further away from being sort of the young boys that she knew them as, and you know, boys that she used to play with, and being dragged into other sort of outside things like selling drugs and things like that. And you sort of see her at school, and sort of like how when she's bullied and how she sort of gets on at school, and it's just so sad. Like, it's a really sad book, but it's really well written. And what she sort of does through the lessons of sort of wizard training is things that she has learned in her life. And I feel like the wizard aspect, I don't know if that was done for like a YA audience, but in a way, in the same way that sort of Freshwater, the character sort of dissociates, the sort of wizard training thing feels a bit of like a dissociation as well, where actually she has to pretend she's in this other world in order to survive the real world that she's living in, because it's that painful that she can't fully stay on it and comprehend. And actually in a lot of the books she talks about the fact that her mother like sort of encourages her to do this or stays the same, so you also sort of wonder if her mum in a way has sort of developed these coping mechanisms as well. It was such a well-rounded book. Like, I really enjoyed it. What the book does is move from like different timelines, so I don't know if when you're reading it if the experience is a little bit different, but when you're listening to it, she sort of sometimes is in one sort of scene where she's talking about something, but literally in the next sentence it will swap to another scene, and then it sort of goes back and forth between that, and there is no obvious like line break or pause in the speech in the audiobook. So I'm really curious to see what that looks like in the physical book, but I quite liked that. I liked the way she sort of played with the narrative and sort of going back and forth between different scenes or scenarios that sort of mirrored each other but were focused on really different topics. So much happens in this book, so sort of like being a kid and having like being bullied, like I said, the drug addiction and things like that, but also like being taken in by other people, like sort of authority figures in your life, to sort of really horrible accidents happening to someone you know. There was just a lot of trauma that she was dealing with, just dealing with general racism, like people who wouldn't allow her and her family to live in certain apartments because they wouldn't accept certain checks, which I think is like sort of to do with like if you get like housing support and things like that. There was just so much in this book, and I just thought, wow, like how wonderful for her to share her life with us, especially when it just feels like she's sharing her innermost darkest secrets. And there's a lot of talk in there about how she feels about herself personally and how she looks, and I don't know, there was just so much in here that she shared with us that I was just like, I couldn't ever imagine being able to share these deeper, darker secrets, but also crafting it so masterfully that actually it reads like a wonderful like novel, but actually it's real life. I thought it was excellently done. Like, I really, really appreciated that she just put this out there for everyone to read, because I really enjoyed it. There were aspects I could relate to, but overall I was just like blown away by her absolute bravery, if I'm honest, because it was just such a stunning collection and also well written. But that is it. That is it for my top 10 books of 2020. Definitely loads of them I will be giving them a reread. I will need to buy Black Girl Unlimited because that deserves a place on my shelf. So let me know what your favourite books of 2020 were. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let's chat in the comments down below, and yeah, I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.